So I think the best thing about what we do from a Blood Origins perspective, we get to go around the world, which is amazing. But even more amazing was to get to meet amazing people and listen to cool, I wouldn't even call it a story. Cool information around wildlife. And I'm a scientist, obviously. My background is science. Been in the restoration ecology field for 25 years. Have my roots in Kruger. That's where I cut my teeth as a restoration ecologist, as trying to figure things out, like with the roan antelope and the roan enclosures on the northern plains of Kruger. And so I was at Custodians last year, and I was fortunate enough to be the program coordinator, so I got to introduce all of these wonderful people. And one of the people that I got to introduce was Jeanetta Selier, Dr. Selier, but I won't call you Dr. Selier because that's just proper, and nobody calls me Dr. Kroger, so we're just... Jeannetta was one of the keynotes. And would you say that the topic that we're going to talk about today and your presentation, it's not controversial at all, right?
Not at all, not at all. It's a very hot topic in South Africa and Southern Africa at the moment, but I think specifically in South Africa, the last couple of months, it's been an extremely hot topic.
So Dr. Jeanetta Selier, welcome to the Blood Origins podcast. It's probably not the last time that we will talk on a podcast like this, because you obviously are involved in ideas and topics and thought processes that we're always interested in exploring and having debates and conversations around and discussions around. Introduce yourself, your background, who you work for.
A senior scientist with the South African National Biodiversity Institute at the moment, providing scientific support to the Scientific Authority of South Africa and then also the wildlife economy. But similar, I have my roots in agriculture. I studied animal husbandry and wildlife sciences, and then continued into the wildlife management field and spent for probably 15 odd years in the field working specifically on elephants, first in a small game reserve in South Africa with reintroduced elephants, a small juvenile herd, and then for the better part of 10 years in the Mapungubwe transfrontier area, specifically looking at the elephant population there and the challenges of managing a cross-border population.
Did you start in Pilanesberg? Is that the juvenile herd that you were talking about from an elephant perspective?
No, even a smaller reserve than Pilanesberg. This is a reserve in the Bella Bella region, Bella Bella area.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, fantastic. So the presentation I listened to was, and obviously you talked a little bit about it, was all about elephant management in Kruger. And obviously it's one of the hottest topics today. And even, as you said, take a step back, just elephant management in general is just a hot topic. Maybe I'll just ask the hardest question to start with. Why do you think it's such a hot topic, Jeanetta?
Well, I think firstly, elephants are one of those amazing creatures that people easily identify with. They scare us. We at awe when we look at them. We can relate to a lot of their behaviors, their social interactions. So everybody has their own value system around elephants, and that differs from individual. It differs also based on your experience with elephants. If you're in the global north, your experiences are linked to Dumbo. And elephants are amazing creatures. If you live somewhere in rural Africa next to an open park with elephants, your perception and view of elephants is going to be very different. And that they threaten your life and that of your family. They threaten your livelihood. And it's a challenge living with them. But it's not to say that rural communities don't have values and don't have these important links. A lot of cultural, spiritual links are within our rural communities and elephants. So they probably have a bit more of a balanced view of elephants than most of us. And then, of course, everybody has different values when they look at our biodiversity. For some people will see a baobab and think that's the most amazing thing. And we could link cultures and history and everything with that. Other people do the same with elephants. And then when those two giants collide, values collide. Because, of course, elephants can impact on baobabs. So now, which is more important, the elephant or the baobab? And how do we manage the interactions between the two?
So how do we just, in my brain, the hardest thing to grapple with, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, is temporal scale. And that we as humans are a blip on the time spectrum, right? We have 90 years, 100 years, give or take, a little bit. That's our viewpoint. That's our view window. When you think of a baobab's view window is 2,000 years. Okay, an elephant is about the same viewscape. It's actually less. I would say 50-ish is probably, or even less, probably from an average perspective, a viewpoint. Is it wrong of us to think in the baobab time frame for what's coming next from a human perspective? And is that why there's a clash?
Also, I think people project forward, and then also people have the, when we started conservation, we had the environment around us looked a certain way. And if you think about the Kruger system, when we started Kruger National Park, there were lots of areas in Kruger with lots of big trees, and it looked a certain way. But as time progressed, it changed. And the question really is that change bad? Is that destruction? Or is that changing a system to something that's is adapted to living with this megafauna? And in order to do that, we shouldn't just look forward, but we also should look back, and we should ask the question, so what happened in the past? And how did these species coexist in the past? If the baobab lived for 2,000 years, it lived during the time when there were lots and lots of elephants. So how come it's still there? What changed that the baobab now is predicted by some to go extinct? And then you have to look at the history.
People have said that elephants were to go extinct in the 70s and 80s, within 5 years or 10 years, FYI.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And so then we have to step back and we say, okay, so what is the history? And if we look at Southern Africa, and let's just stick to South Africa because that's Kruger National Park, we went through a phase where, historically there were lots of elephants. Elephants were across the whole of the Southern African landscape and across the whole of South Africa. Then we had a period where there was a lot of hunting, there was a lot of killing, and there was a lot of competition between agricultural people establishing themselves in South Africa and wildlife. By the towards the end of the 1800s, elephants were gone from the landscape. But it wasn't only elephants that were gone. Rhinos were gone. Large megafauna, giraffes, hippo, all of those species were at very low numbers. Even general game were at low numbers. That we didn't kill out also then got hit by rinderpest. So going into the 1900s, we were at a probably all-time low looking at our wildlife numbers. As animal numbers decrease, your environment adapts to those changes. So tree species and elephants are like us. They have ice cream, they have cabbage and spinach, and then they have species that they avoid, that they don't like. So ice cream species, if there's elephants around, are going to be in very low densities because elephants will seek them out. The cabbage and spinach will always be there because those are the trees that are adapted to living with elephants, and the rest of the trees are across your landscape. So with elephant numbers and your other megafauna declining, our ice cream species, fall trees, those things started increasing in numbers. And there's also a whole bunch of other ecological processes that we shouldn't forget that are taking place at the same time. Then we start conservation. And we grow these elephant numbers, and things start changing. Now we start getting worried. Are these changes good or bad? So that's where we started managing elephants. But at the time Kruger started managing elephants, They didn't they not only managed elephants, they also had a very strict fire regime. They were controlling other animal numbers, and all of that in basically an intensely managed situation that was around the 60s, starting in the 60s and intensifying around the 80s and the 90s. In
Jeanette, from a
order
history
really
perspective, though, do we feel like if we go back in the record, the Kruger landscape obviously historically was open? Okay. Do we think historically there were elephants in the Kruger landscape?
Yeah.
There were? Maybe. So
Yeah.
give me a little bit of a time frame there, because it sounded like there were elephants maybe, we're talking 1600s, 1700s, but then in the 1800s, things started sliding down up into the 1900s.
Yeah, so I would say we probably had up until, and it's hard, I don't have the exact, but roughly I would say probably until the late 1800s, rinderpest then kicked in. So going into the 1900s, there were a remnant population left around the Olifants River. And that's where Kruger's population then, we never reintroduced elephants into Kruger. They grew from the remnant population that remained within that area. Kruger always had elephants. But also remember that while Kruger had elephants, there were also people in Kruger. Prior to the establishment of the national park, there were people living in parts of what is today Kruger National Park. And that would have also had an effect of where elephants were spending their time in that landscape.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about it when we were together. It's almost when you start looking at Kruger, Kruger's a closed system. It's a very intensely managed system. And when it comes to management, you have to ask a bigger question, like, what is management? Management, in my frame of reference, and this comes from speaking to people that are doing the work, is essentially implementing things that are missing in the system because you've closed the system off. And it sounds like, we talked about it, humans is part of that. Like the role of humans in Kruger, where they lived, how they interacted with wildlife, how they pushed animals around. I think we've tried, or maybe you can speak to it. We've tried to replicate those things, but maybe we haven't done it exactly the way that it was happening historically.
So I think, maybe to start from the beginning, what you were saying. So we did manage Kruger very intensively over the 80s and 90s, and that wasn't actually very successful. If we look at the culling program for elephants, the purpose of culling was the assumption that if we bring down the numbers or manage the numbers, trees won't die. That didn't work out that way. Trees were still dying at the same rate than they were dying prior to bringing elephant numbers down. As I say, we also had the fire regimes and all of that, and Kruger was fenced. From about the late 90s, early 2000s, we actually let up on our management. We started managing less intensively and following the process you were saying in looking at maintaining, restoring, where we can't do that, mimicking ecological processes that we think is absent in the system. So with the elephants, we realized one of the key drivers for where elephants are within the landscape and how long the time they spend in the landscape is water. Kruger in the 60s, 70s, and 80s established a huge amount of artificial waterholes, mainly for tourism purposes. So we closed down a lot of those waterholes and we opened up Kruger. So Kruger is actually only partially fenced. Kruger is open to Mozambique and also to Zimbabwe. So we now actually have a system where we've got a shared elephant population that goes out of Kruger into Mozambique, walk the length of Mozambique, go back into South Africa and go visit the Tembe elephants. And they make their way back to Kruger. So we've let up on our management. And that has also allowed for certain ecological processes and biological processes in elephants to kick in. Self-regulation, self-management of numbers that couldn't kick in because we were managing so intensively. And interesting enough, once we started letting up on some of these very intense management systems, we also started seeing other species numbers increase. For example, roan and sable. And a lot of species that numbers were declining because of the intense management. Not saying that sable declined because we culled elephant, but it's all of the management things that were taking place, the artificial water holes, the burning regimes that changed the grass composition and attracted certain species that would not necessarily have occurred in that area.
One of the key things that I noticed in the presentation was this whole idea of water, the sort of artificial placement of water and how it skewed, I'm going to use movement, but how it skewed different uses of the landscape of elephants.
Absolutely.
What did you
water is
talk
one
to
of
that? What you found there?
I mean, you're 100% right. I mean, water is one of the key drivers for elephant and where they spend time, how long they spend time in those areas. So when you have a natural system where there's only little bits of water and water is less during your dry season, more during your wet season, what we see is that elephants are concentrated around these permanent water holes during the dry season. And I have to spend a lot of time moving because food and water is far apart. And that then impacts the survival rate, specifically of the young juveniles. So the first year that a calf is independent of the mother, so roughly 3, 4, 5 years, and you see higher mortality rates there. Elephants lose condition. And then the wet season comes, there's water everywhere. So water is no longer a driver. And they spend more time away from these intensively utilized areas of the dry season in a broader landscape, also allowing those natural eco processes to take place. The best time for recovery of an area is the wet season. I mean, any farmer would tell you that if you want to have an area recover, let it recover over the best time of the year. So elephants do that naturally. But now what happens when we have water everywhere? Then why do I need to move? Why do I have to go anywhere else? So then I use the area that I'm in more intensely for a much longer time period. And then we start seeing negative impacts. We also see the impact that calves don't die. Now, for some people, that's good. But if elephants don't die, then there's no regulation of numbers.
Yeah.
And in a natural population, that is where nature regulates the population, is firstly in a juvenile age. And then if we have these massive droughts, of course, then you start seeing reproduction decreasing and you're also seeing the old animals dying. So if we don't have that, more calf survives, numbers increase more rapidly, and impact increases because elephants are spending lots and lots of time in the same area. We actually tested this with science. So we looked at home range overlap across Africa. And in most parts of Africa, the overlap between the wet and the dry season were anything from 0 to 35%. In Kruger, before we closed down the water holes, elephants were spending 75% of their time in exactly the same place.
Interesting. And that and when elephants are staying in the same place for 3/4 of their time, has the science shown, because obviously logic makes this argument, going to hit all the ice cream species. They're going to get smashed. Okay?
Yeah.
So are we seeing those negative impacts on those ice cream species because of sedentary, or because of that 75%? So you are seeing changes in those species, whether it's trees or whatever it is, right?
So we have seen that. And we also see that in our smaller reserves where a lot of these processes can't take place. We can't change the way elephants utilize their space. So in Kruger, just by closing down the water holes, we forced elephants to move when we started seeing increases in juvenile mortalities, and we're seeing a drop in the growth rate of the elephant population across the Kruger landscape. And we're seeing elephants using the landscape more variable. And that's also what we want. So elephants are ecosystem engineers. They change the landscape. And we want a landscape that heterogeneous. So there's heterogeneity across the landscape. It's a terrible word to pronounce. And the more heterogeneity you have across the landscape, the more species can survive. So you have places where the little duiker is going to be happy. You can have places where certain bird species would be happy. When the area is homogeneous, there's a very small number of species that can survive. So that's the balance that we're looking for with elephants. If elephants change the entire landscape to look the same, that's a problem. If elephants change certain areas in the landscape, that's a good thing. The trade-off is still with ice cream species, and especially when we look at the smaller landscapes, is how do we balance the marula tree and elephants?
Right.
And that is a very complicated thing, and there's no simple solutions to that. And sometimes it's admitting that we can't have both in the same area and making a decision.
So what about
this is a marula reserve.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing, right? You've got to decide. Well, people would argue that there is a balance, i.e., control your elephant numbers, and we can have 10 marulas, or we'd prefer 10 versus
Unlikely.
0. Why do you say unlikely?
Yeah, probably unlikely. Because, elephants are like kids. You can hide the ice cream or the sweets anywhere you like in a house. They're going to look until they found them. And similar with elephants. So those ice cream species, except if they're on a ridge, somewhere where an elephant can't get access to them, they are going to find those trees. But there's also ways of thinking about botanical reserves within reserves and creating botanical reserves around lodges. Most of our lodges are fenced because we don't want elephants next to the tents where people sleep at night. So creating those little reserves within the broader reserve, we can protect some of those ice cream species. And often ice cream species, the marula tree is not endangered. And a lot of our reserves, if you drive through the areas leading up to the reserve, there are lots of marula trees. And then you get into the reserve and they're very scarce. But the bigger the landscape, the more likely you are to be able to balance all these things out. It's in the smaller landscapes, in the fenced landscapes, that the trade-offs are often quite difficult. And Kruger still got marula trees.
Yeah. Are you suggesting, though, for that balance of the tourist that says, I want, I've been seeing marula trees forever in Kruger, now I don't see any, that at the current elephant population of, let's just call it 30,000, 31,000, whatever it is in Kruger, that to achieve any sort of semblance of what you're used to, the elephant population needs to be at such a low density that really the ice cream species overwhelm what density of elephants there are on the landscape, right?
Very much, yeah.
And you're saying that the fact that you grew up in Kruger, I grew up in Kruger, seeing all the marulas and whatnot, was an artifact of, and again, I don't know the temporal lifespan, going back to the original question of temporal scale. I don't know the temporal lifespan of a marula, to get into a, say, 50 centimeter diameter tree, if that's a 50-year or 60-year or 70-year or 30-year. I don't know what that time scale is. But it makes sense if you looked at Kruger from let's just call it 1920 through 1970, a 50-year time frame where your elephant density was likely less than 2,000, or 2,000 to 6,000. Let's just call it, a range. Let's put a range on there. That there wasn't enough elephants in the landscape to change really anything that you were seeing?
I think so. I mean, I must be honest, I haven't looked at the data in that much detail, but it would make sense to me. And then, you know, again, until Kruger started as a national park, there were also areas where those trees were protected by people in villages that were living there, areas that there was high people activity. And humans are safety is one of the other drivers for elephants. So work that I've done in the Greater Mapungubwe showed that especially breeding herds select safety above good resources. They first go to places where they're safe, and then they select for the resources that's available in that safe space. So similar, within Kruger, elephants would have avoided areas with high human densities. And those areas, that is where some of your sensitive species would probably have persisted for much longer. And if you
Mm-hmm.
think where people like to live is generally on river edges, close to rivers, close to wetlands, where all their resources are easily accessible. So that's probably why we see these niches within Kruger as well, where we have these sensitive areas that have persisted for a much longer period than other parts of the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
So for us, it's now also looking and saying, well, how do we mimic human presence in the Kruger landscape? So maybe putting a ranger station there, So what are the kind of things that we could do that create a disturbance effect for elephants in avoiding or spending less time in those areas and then not having as high impact? Because this is where all the ice cream is. So why am I not going to be there? Something needs to
Yeah.
make me not go there.
Yeah. Jeanetta, sorry. Do we historically think that there were this many elephants constantly in Kruger? Like and I think this is the key. We've been talking about it the entire time. I would say that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the answer is probably yes, but in the 16, 17, 1800s.
Yeah.
But they weren't
Yeah.
resident. They would move out, right?
Not
It'd be more of a...
necessarily. So
Go ahead.
elephants, sorry, yeah. So elephants are also very much like us. They homebodies. They don't move. You do get migrating elephants, and elephants would have moved when resources are limited. So if you have these massive droughts, they would have moved somewhere where they would find what they need. But in general, if you look at elephant behavior, is these set home ranges that a breeding herd occupies in the dry season, the wet season, and it hardly changes year on year. So my feeling is that there were parts of Kruger that probably always had elephants, and there were parts of Kruger where there probably were less elephants because the resources didn't really allow for it, or they would have only been there at certain times because it's away from water. So areas with less water would have only had elephants in the wet season, and areas with long perennial rivers would have had elephants all year round. We also got to remember,
or humans, right? We've talked about that.
And humans
on
exactly.
Those river systems. Yeah.
Exactly. So you would have had this patchwork across the landscape. And then we also got to remember that our river systems looked a hell of a lot different than they do today. I mean, if you think about the 1800s, 1600s, 1800s, Limpopo River was a massive perennial river. And today it's a dry riverbed, with water for a couple of months in a year if we're lucky. So that also changes the dynamics, not only of elephants, but also of the trees that persist in that area. So we like to keep things the same, but ecosystems are a continuous flux. They're constantly changing, adapting. And what we want really is a resilient system that can take these knocks, climate change, rivers that stop flowing. If we have a resilient system, it can adapt and change. If we maintain a system in a certain constant state, it's not resilient. It won't be able to adapt to the changes.
Jeanetta, do you think that the elephant population, again, this is data that you showed me, do we think the elephant population in Kruger is going to stabilize? Because right now, all it seems to be doing is increasing.
So the science have shown that stabilizing dynamics kick in the broader Kruger system, roughly at about 35 to 40,000 elephants. And we're seeing the first signs of that in Kruger. Our growth rate has come down quite a bit. Of course, we're obviously looking at a much bigger landscape than just Kruger. There's the Limpopo National Park, there's Gonorrhea Zoo, Kruger elephants are visiting Tembe. So it's really hard to look at this across the landscape. But within Kruger, definitely we've seen a drop in the growth rate, and we've seen these fluxes of elephant numbers going down in Kruger and then slightly going up, which seems to be more an artifact of immigration and immigration than rapid growth rate, population increasing in numbers because of births.
I thought I saw in your presentation you had a graph of Gonorrhea Zoo as well, though, that had gone through very similar system that Kruger's gone through, right?
Yeah. And similar with Gonorrhea Zoo, they're showing they're expecting density dependence to kick in at roughly 10 to 15,000, and similar that is starting to happen there.
So I guess the biggest question we have to answer, and we've both said it already, is how do we, from a management perspective, put this human factor around the sensitive ecosystems in a way that, I don't want to put it very bluntly, but tells elephants hey, you don't want to be in here. I've got a simple solution.
So what is your solution?
I think you've got to make a landscape of fear. And you got to, this idea of, again, this is going to be the most controversial thing. And if people blip me out and say this is what I'm about, it's not. But if this is a landscape of that humans used to dominate, used to push elephants out of, they used to come in sort of sneakily at night, got their water, and out they went. I'll give you I think the solution, then I'll give you a silly solution. But I think with the ranges that you have on the landscape, and if you put one elephant down in those systems, just a female, something or juvenile tied to your density dependence scenario, okay, that creates a landscape of fear because of elephants and their interaction with humans. And they're going to be like, we don't want to spend any more time here because, hey, something happened that we don't like. And I honestly think, again, that is probably the simplest solution and something worth trying. I'd love to see the science behind it. I'd love to see the movement patterns of elephants. And you'd have to do, again, look at vegetation before and after, do some sort of T-test or a Backy design. Or a silly solution is allow the tourists to walk the riverbeds. Just let them out and let them walk and interact with the elephants.
Sign an indemnity.
Oh, make them sign it at the front, yeah. But
so, I think there are many different ways, and definitely, landscape of fear can be created in many different ways. The first thing that you need to establish is, why are elephants spending time there? So is it because of the water? Well, then it's very simple. Move the water.
Yeah, but you can't move the water on a river, on a big river.
Yes, yeah. So and then we also, you also got to balance people and people needs, elephant needs. So and making sure that there are other places for elephants to be. But let's say this is a sensitive area around a river, creating any kind of disturbance. And you're right, in small reserves, we are thinking we're looking at a meta-population management strategy for South Africa, guidelines for meta-population management. And there, the key thing as well is to mimic natural processes. So if you want to mimic mortality it doesn't help culling a whole herd. That doesn't happen. But if you were to take out a number of juveniles, so you take out in the same age class as when nature would have taken out the animals, yes, it has an impact on the breeding herd. But they also have natural coping strategies to deal with that. Because in her lifetime, she's going to lose a number of calves. It's a natural process, so she can cope with it. So, and there's not many coping mechanisms for elephants to deal with a whole herd being shot by a thing that's flying in the sky. That's not in their natural processing. So we're not saying it won't have an impact, but they have natural coping mechanisms to deal with that, and it's less intrusive than some of the other options out there. And we could theoretically also use it as a disturbance factor. And it's, again, is what makes elephants stay in that area, and then what are the actions we can take to create a landscape that elephants don't want to spend a lot of time in there. Either put humans in the area that disturbs them, so, temporary rangers camp, or creating a disturbance through, yes, in some cases, it may be that we need to shoot an elephant or two to create, if it is a sensitive enough area where we do feel that this is an area that needs an immediate response and a severe response, then it's possible. I don't want to talk for Kruger. These are theoretical options
of course not.
that
Of
Kruger
course
could
not.
consider. And they, of course, everything they would do will fall within the legislation of South Africa and will be captured within their elephant management plan.
No, 100%. I want to move beyond Kruger to these smaller reserves, because these smaller reserves seem to, it's obviously Kruger on steroids, in that the management needs to be so intense. And obviously Madikwe has been in the headlines, still is in the headlines. It's going to be back in the headlines once everything dries out again. You're a scientist, you're also a pragmatist. What do you do? Like, in my brain, again, I'll be the martyr here. When I look at a Madikwe, to me, there's only one solution in Madikwe. Is 800 elephants need to go.
So maybe let's go back a little bit and say, okay, well, what happened to these populations? So when we stopped culling in Kruger, there was a big demand for elephants across the South African landscape. It was at the same time, it's about the same time where we had the Game Safe Act being implemented, and private landowners now had the right to own under certain conditions, wildlife and benefit from wildlife. So lots and lots of reserves wanted elephants. It's probably one of the very few cases where if you ask for 5, you got 10. That generally doesn't happen. But we were constrained in the size of the elephants that we could deliver. First, it was only the very young animals, so literally looking at juveniles, teenagers. And later we could introduce young family groups. Now, earlier you mentioned, elephants live for 50, 60 odd years, sometimes a little bit longer if the resources are good. So if we introduce 15-year-old elephants into a game reserve with lots and lots and lots of ice cream and great resources, lots of water, they don't have to walk far, there are a bunch of juveniles, what is going to happen? Well, we're going to see breeding at a rapid rate. And that's exactly what we saw in these populations. The age structures were skewed, the sex ratio was skewed. We hardly had any bulls in these reserves. There were no bull structure, very young females. And we had records broken in our South African reserves, and maximum growth rate for elephants are 8%. Well, ours exceeded 12% plus. And that growth rate will continue until the first elephants start dying. But when are elephants going to start dying? Well, when they reach 50. So how many years are that of growth?
Yeah.
So if you introduce them at 15, was it 45 odd years? Let's say 35 odd years until the first
35,
elephant
yeah.
is going to start dying. So we're still in that growth phase. Most of our populations actually haven't hit an elephant. Madikwe is the first, where we now start seeing old elephants dying. And now we're concerned about it, but elephants also have an age limitation. And what we've seen in Madikwe now is the juveniles dying. So that is what would happen in the natural population, is that first year of weaning, that those animals are dying. And we started seeing about a couple of older animals dying. So, well, I do agree that I think there is some concerns in Madikwe, and it's more around the homogenization of the reserve. The numbers there is not so much for me a concern. It's the fact that elephants are not using that landscape variably. The fact that we're seeing elephants dying, I think is fantastic. It's showing that certain natural processes are kicking in. Removing 800 elephants from that population is going to be a massive challenge. And I think the repercussions of that is going to be enormous, not just reputational, not just on the ecotourism product, but also on the elephants. And all that's going to happen, we're going to end up exactly where we were in a rapid growing population that's going to try and reach a certain density, and we will have to continue doing what we're doing. Now, we could look at contraception. So we could say, okay, we're going to bite the bullet. We're going to take off a bunch of elephants, put them on contraception to reduce the growth rate over time. And potentially, and then we'll need to look at how do we look at variability in that system. Unfortunately, Madikwe is also not a very varied system. So there is not, naturally a huge amount of variability in that reserve. There is a task
Jeanetta,
team that has been appointed. Sorry?
Did they not have a, again, in my brain, and again, when I said 800 need to go, it was a very simplistic, hey, this is what needs to happen. But I think, again, this is the point of this discussion, is I wanted to open people's eyes to things that they need to consider. So if 800 animals have to go, then what? Because as you say,
exactly,
you've now created an abundance of resources that the elephant population will refill over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. In my brain, and I'd love to hear your thoughts here, is these smaller reserves have to come to a decision on a couple of things of value. Aesthetics is big, and that's the social component, which is what we're hearing a lot of. There's no trees left, there's no nothing left. Well, that's an aesthetic value, that's a social value, okay? If the decision of Madikwe was we're okay it looking homogeneous, then that's a decision that's been made. Or the decision is, again, and with that homogeneous, we want a density dependent elephant population in Madikwe. Okay, if that's the goal, then we're on the right track. Or do we want a balanced? We want lots of trees. We want all the game not to be, in balance with one another. That's a different set of ideals in which a scientist can say, look, if based on the competing values that you've said you have priority around, we can't have 1,500 elephants. We can only, based on your decision of what you want, we think we need to keep it at 500. So then the question is, how do you keep it at 500?
I agree with you. And also, in that, it also has to be realistic. So again, just coming back to the whole, the initial thing is impact is not linked to elephant numbers. Impact is linked to where elephants spend time, how long they spend in that area, what they're doing when they're in that area. So
But
even if
that
you
must be tied to numbers in Madikwe. It has to be.
not really, because certain tree species in Madikwe, again, whether you have 100 elephants or 1,000 elephants, elephants can utilize the whole of Madikwe, and they will utilize those trees first, and they will spend time in those areas where those species are that they like longer, because that is where their resources are. That's where the things that are that they like. And because you have a system that's not so variable, these patches of sensitivity are very clear and they will utilize them. So you either have to prevent them from getting to these patches, or you will have to sacrifice these patches. And it's really got nothing to do with numbers. It's got to do with the fact that elephants can move across that entire landscape, and that the
Do
landscape
you,
is small enough or too small to have this variability in use. We could try it in some places, but where our focus has been for so many years, so strongly focused on, if we manage numbers, we're going to manage impact, that and we've never really tested whether that's, except for Kruger, they've done it and they've shown it doesn't work, whether they're actually achieving our outcome. So again, now we'll need to go back and we'll need to start adaptively managing, and we need to start managing impacts at the local scale. So where is the issue? What part of my reserve, where my reserve are my sensitive areas, the areas that I need to look after, and how am I going to manage the impact in that specific area? Reducing elephant numbers across are not going to address sensitivity issues within a reserve. It
so
needs
I agree with
other
you. I agree
strategies.
with you. I think there's two things at play here. Is one, sensitive species, the ice cream species you've been talking about. And as we've discussed as we talked about in Kruger, and we both agreed, there's an elephant number under which sensitive species are going to survive. Okay. However, I would disagree in terms of the numbers argument when it goes beyond the sensitive species. And that's when we've been talking about, in my brain, as the homogenization of the landscape. Is in a Madikwe reserve, I don't see how it's not tied to numbers when you go beyond the sensitivity argument, beyond the sensitive ecosystem argument. But now we've gotten rid of the ice cream species. Now all that's left is spinach and cabbage and everything else that we're going to smash because we have to eat it, and we're homogenizing everything. To me, that has to be a numbers issue.
Yeah, really. And what is interesting, we were looking at Madikwe, and, one of the arguments that were put forward prior to the Madikwe situation where we're in now, and look, there's a lot of work still need to be done, and the team at Madikwe is looking at all the different things. And as I said, there's also a task team that's been, that Northwest is busy putting together to delve even deeper into this. But what was interesting is people were saying, well, elephants will be the last to survive. By the time elephants start dying, everything else is going to be gone. All other animals are going to die. What we've seen in Madikwe this year is that everyone else is doing fine. The body condition of some species have dropped, but that is expected. It's the end of the late dry season. It drops every year. But there is hardly any other species mortalities. Even the black rhino, which competes with elephant for browse, were doing fine. The white rhino were doing fine, and there were no mortalities within these species. So for me, that's an indicator that resource limitations are not the major issue at the moment. It's resource limitations in certain levels and the impact on juveniles at this stage. So I'm not saying numbers are completely out of the game, but thinking that numbers are gonna, if we sort out the numbers, we bring the numbers down, we're going to sort out impact. It's not going to happen. What we do need is also to look at, as I say, Madikwe through the natural process, because they haven't contracepted, now got to an age structure that seems to be more representative of a natural elephant population. A lot of our reserves, what we're trying to do is through contraception, is to slow down the growth rate so we can get to those age structures and not have that rapid growth rate. So, that's where you actually pre-planning, you're planning ahead and saying, I realize what we've done, and we're going to contracept to a point, not contracept the entire population, but contracept so that we reduce our growth rate so we can get our age structure right, so we can get independence as some stage kicking in, where we have births and deaths. Now we just have births, we don't have deaths.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a fascinating discussion and argument, because I think there's things that people don't consider in this whole scenario. Okay. Yeah. And I think one of the things that you just mentioned, from the anti side, from the NSPCA side, the anti people who hunt side, and I think a little bit the hunting community understands this better. I don't think they understand it completely, but is the idea of death, and that death is part of the natural cycle. We're a part of it. From a hunting community, we operate as that predator. As the predator that does mitigate, that does put death into the system, that does manage populations, just like any other predator does. Now, elephants are unique because elephants don't have predators. Okay, and so the only thing that's going to control elephants for time memoriam, like we've just discussed, is a landscape of fear through humans, because humans have been interacting with elephants for forever. Okay, and some sort of density dependence that says, okay, elephants, you need to control yourselves, and we're going to start knocking down those that can't, which is the juveniles and calf, and we're going to slow your growth rate down. And or some sort of disease comes into the population, or drought, environmental, that knocks the population down back to, whatever it is. You've got to, you roll on top of that the fact that we're now living in a society, or now not a society, we're now living in a world in which these habitats that used to be completely open, that were free-flowing, immigration, the whole kit and caboodle, are now confined. And the smaller the confined area, the more we have to be diligent about management. But I think, as I've mentioned, we have to be more diligent about what is it that you want.
Correct.
What is it that you want out of this area? If it is, we want just a beautiful aesthetic, large trees, and everything's going to be fine, then you shouldn't have elephants. Okay? But you have elephants. And so if you want a balance, then there's things that we can think about. And everything should be on the table. Every tool should be on the table. Contraception, your meta-population idea of moving elephants around, bringing in elephants that are older age class. Now that we have the technology to bring in an older age class elephant instead of a 15-year-old, bring in a 35-year-old. I think I just saw the thing in Kenya, like the biggest elephant ever was translocated. What was it? 11,600 pounds? Stupid big elephant. Okay? We can do that nowadays. But I think, and then death, and then, self-regulating and death, like you see baby elephants dying, it's shocking. It is. And could we have done something about the image of the death? Maybe. If, again, the conversation had been made about what do you want? If you want ecotourism, from an ecotourism perspective, as many elephants as you possibly can have in Madikwe, this is what's going to happen. So,
yeah, my mom always used to say, you can't have your cake and eat it. And if we, on the one hand, we have people opposed to managing elephants. We need need to let them go, and they need to live happy lives. But happy lives also mean dying. And for an old elephant to die, basically they die of starvation. That's how elephants die. Their molars are worn down, they can't chew their food properly, and they can't get in the resources that they need. Juveniles die for a similar reason. They can't get enough resources to sustain the distances that they have to walk over the dry season. But all of that is built in. That's how elephants have been living long before we were on this planet. And I have those natural coping mechanisms to deal with that. So for me, this is not a welfare issue. This is a natural systems process that's taking place. When we start managing, we need to think about the duty of care. And we need to think about how do we manage, and is our management in line with the coping mechanisms that animals have? And that way, we think about maintaining, restoring, mimicking processes that would naturally taken place. And you're 100% right. In today's scenarios that we live in, is very fragmented, human-dominated landscapes where people also need to make each other living. In certain countries, socioeconomic development is extremely important. Everything should be on the table. The conservation toolbox should be big, not small. We shouldn't be taking out tools. We should be putting in more. And we should be discussing those tools rather than saying trophy hunting is off the table because I don't like it. Rather have a discussion around, so what is best practice when we talk about trophy hunting for elephants? If we want to cull, what would be best practice? What should we cull that it mimics processes and that we are considering our duty of care as managers and custodians of these animals? This whole division and fighting about tools for me is is unproductive and is not helping the conservation of the species. They need to be more frank, open debate and discussion around.
Well, I think that there's great models. I think there's great models all around Africa, even in South Africa, that people actually don't even know is actually happening. Where hunting and ecotourism are harmoniously working together.
Namibia is a really good example. The community conservancies in Namibia is a very good example.
Yeah, and look, I think the example I would use is Timbavati. Timbavati is a great system that works very well. High-end ecotourism, highest-end ecotourism you have in South Africa. Perfectly marries with hunting. And it's not, and trophy hunting is used as bastardized in terms of its terminology and its name and its moniker. Really, trophy is in the eye of the beholder. So if somebody like Timbavati has, when people dig into it, has the strictest elephant hunting protocols in the world.
Absolutely.
And there's significant consequences for breaking those protocols. And they're not the big 80, 90, 100-pound protocols. They're 30-pound, 35-year-old elephants that, are not trophies in anybody in the bastardized word of trophy hunting. There's no way you can even classify it that way. But for the person who's decided that that's the elephant they want, to them, that's a trophy.
Exactly.
Whether it's the experience, the adventure, the people, whatever it is. I think you're right. I'm with you, man. When I start thinking about land use that is beneficial for wildlife around the world, writ large, you think about everything that has a land use in this country, in this world, you're probably left with single-digit percentages of uses that are wildlife-based. And then when you expand that single digit out, you've got ecotourism, you've got a photographic ecotourism, you've got hunting tourism, you've now got obviously the carbon biodiversity credit component to it, you've got your philanthropic model, you've got your state national park government-driven model, and quasi-wilderness. That's it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, Jeanetta, I appreciate your time, and I love the fact that um, these are the kinds of conversations I love because, I've got an opinion, you have an opinion. It's the kind of thing that society needs, is just good, amicable discussion where people can banter around ideas and almost use each other as sounding boards. Because there's things that I hadn't considered that you had said.
I agree. I mean, the more we discuss this, we learn from each other. And, the model that Southern Africa has been using as adaptive management, learn by doing. And so we make mistakes, but we try and learn from them and try and do better next time. And it's great to have, we should be having more of these conversations. It's open and frank without judgment.
100%. Well, I look forward to the next one. Maybe we do it in person in South Africa.
Thank you very much.
Okay?
Good. Sounds good.